Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu.
Wa alaikum assalam.
Usually when we talk about diagnosing a problem, there's this comforting expectation of precision.
Right. Yeah. Like you want a clear answer.
Exactly. Like if we look at engineering or even something biological, like a broken arm, the process is incredibly linear. You take an X-ray, you see that jagged white line on the black film, and the doctor just points and says, there is the fracture.
Yeah. It's completely binary. It's either broken or not broken. We really gravitate toward that kind of clarity.
We do. We want our issues to be visible, categorized, and, well, easily remedied with a cast or a simple formula. But the moment you step into the world of human behavior...
Oh, that's where it all falls apart.
Right. You step into neurodevelopment, trauma, emotional regulation, and that X-ray machine just shatters. We find ourselves looking at a diagnostic landscape that is, frankly, incredibly murky.
And that murkiness is exactly why today's deep dive is so vital.
Absolutely. Welcome, everyone. Today's mission is unpacking a highly comprehensive scholarly report. It's titled The Quranic Manual for Good Character, an exegetical and scholarly synthesis.
And for you listening, our objective today is not merely like an academic review of historical theology.
No, definitely not.
We are extracting a highly practical, psychologically astute blueprint for human behavior. In the Islamic tradition, this overarching concept of human conduct and disposition, it's known as Akhlaq, or character.
And the sources we are pulling from today offer an incredibly robust framework. We're talking about a synthesis that bridges this massive temporal gap.
Right. On one hand, we have heavy-hitting classical scholars, names like Al-Tabari, Al-Qurtubi, Ibn Kathir, and Ibn al-Qayyim.
These guys laid the foundational exegesis centuries ago.
Centuries ago, yeah. But then, on the other hand, the report places them right alongside modern analytical voices, people like Yasir Qadhi, Omar Suleiman, and Nouman Ali Khan.
And taking insights from a millennium ago and realizing how perfectly they map onto our contemporary understanding of psychology. I mean, it's fascinating.
It really is. The overarching theme of this synthesis shows how Islamic theology intricately binds faith directly to everyday manners. It connects to emotional regulation and social justice.
So it's suggesting that faith isn't just an abstract concept residing in your intellect. It's the actual engine dictating how you speak to a stressed-out barista.
Right, or how you navigate a tense family dispute.
Yeah, or how you regulate your own nervous system when someone recklessly cuts you off in traffic.
Exactly. But to even begin applying this manual, we have to recalibrate our understanding of what character actually is, at least according to the Orthodox Sunni intellectual tradition.
Because in our modern, kind of secularized environment, we often view good character as a supplementary trait, don't we?
We do. It's treated as the cherry on top of a successful life. Like, the primary goals are usually intelligence, financial success, influence.
And if you happen to be polite and empathetic along the way, well, society views that as a wonderful but ultimately optional bonus.
It is entirely peripheral.
I mean, we have this cultural archetype of the brilliant but cruel genius, and society often just gives them a pass. We tolerate terrible behavior if the person is perceived as successful or highly competent.
Yeah, but the epistemological baseline of this tradition dismantles that entirely. Cultivating noble character Akhlaq is not a peripheral recommendation. It is the absolute bedrock of the faith.
Bedrock. Wow.
Yeah, the Prophet Muhammad made a definitive statement regarding his mandate. He explicitly stated that his entire divine mission was to perfect righteous character.
Think about that for a second. If we pause and weigh the implications of that statement, it completely reorients the purpose of religion.
It really does.
Like, out of all the intricate legal codes, the complex metaphysical realities of heaven and hell, the establishment of a massive civilization, he distills the ultimate objective down to the perfection of human character.
And the classical scholars understood this hierarchy perfectly. They didn't treat ethics and manners as an afterthought to law.
No, they established an independent, paramount science for it, right?
Exactly, Tatib al-Akhlaq, the discipline of character refinement. Many classical authorities argued that an individual must intensely study this science long before they ever attempt to study advanced theology or jurisprudence.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, the classical polymath Ibn al-Qayyim al-Jawziyya intricately bound internal belief and outward behavior together. In his seminal work, he asserted that the religion itself is entirely good character. So whoever surpasses you in character has surpassed you in religion.
Wait, whoever surpasses you in character has surpassed you in religion. That single sentence invalidates the concept of the religiously devout individual who treats their family or neighbors terribly.
100%. It creates a paradigm where your ritualistic devotion is inherently defective if your interpersonal conduct is flawed.
Al-Shatibi, another major architectural mind of Islamic jurisprudence, he took this even further, didn't he?
He did. He argued that the entirety of Islamic law, the Sharia itself, exists solely as a mechanism to create noble morals. Every single rule, every prohibition, every mandated prayer or charity is simply a tool designed to produce a human being with excellent character.
So the law serves the character, not the other way around.
Exactly.
But if character is the ultimate metric of faith, that forces us to confront a massive psychological hurdle. And the modern scholarly commentary in our sources grapples with this extensively.
You're talking about the nature versus nurture debate?
Yeah, because a listener might be thinking, look, I have a naturally fiery temper, or I am naturally impatient. Isn't that just my biological baseline?
Right, like, am I being graded on an impossible curve against someone who was simply born with a Zen disposition?
Exactly. It's a really fair question.
It's the essential crisis of human behavior. To resolve it, modern academic frameworks, like those articulated by Yasir Qadhi, dive into the linguistic roots of the Arabic terminology. The word for character, akhlaq, is the plural form of the word kuluk. Now, kuluk shares the exact same morphological root as the word khalq.
And Kalk refers to the physical creation, right?
Yeah.
The biological blueprint. So we're talking about unalterable traits like your height, eye color, bone structure.
Things you cannot change through sheer willpower.
Right.
Correct. So khalq is your physical outward composition. Kuluk, sharing that root, defines your internal spiritual and moral disposition.
Okay, so the shared linguistic root implies a deep relationship. That fuels the debate among scholars. Is our moral character as permanently fixed as our physical height, or is it acquired?
Qadhi's synthesis seems to strike a very deliberate middle ground here. He introduces the concept of spiritual DNA.
Spiritual DNA, I like that.
Yeah, the idea is that we all possess a baseline temperament. One person might be naturally predisposed to profound generosity, while another might have a natural inclination toward irritability or, anxiety.
But the crucial takeaway from this concept is that acknowledging a biological or spiritual predisposition never absolves anyone from the responsibility of self-improvement.
Exactly. You cannot use your temperament as an alibi.
Yeah, you might have been dealt a difficult psychological hand, but you're still entirely responsible for how you play those cards.
The tradition defines this act of responsibility as riyadat al-nafs, the rigorous training or disciplining of the soul. The Quranic methodology operates on the uncompromising premise that all behavioral traits are malleable.
Through conscious effort.
Yes. Through a systematic framework of theoretical knowledge, studying prophetic role models, and relentless practical implementation, you can literally rewire your character.
It shifts the internal narrative. Instead of saying, I'm an angry person, everyone needs to deal with it, you say, I have a predisposition to anger, therefore my lifelong spiritual work is to master it.
And to make this monumental lifelong task digestible, classical scholars sought to synthesize the vast compendium of behavioral ethics into manageable core principles.
Right, because otherwise it's just overwhelming.
The renowned Maliki jurist Ibn Abi Zayd al-Qayrawani famously distilled the entirety of Islamic character teachings down to just 4 foundational prophetic traditions, or hadith.
Just 4.
Just 4. He proposed that if an individual masters the psychology behind these 4 maxims, they have effectively mastered the science of Akhlaq.
Let's dissect these 4 pillars, because they form the operational matrix for everything else we'll discuss.
Right.
I imagine the first one deals with the most common source of interpersonal destruction, the tongue.
You are absolutely right. The first maxim governs linguistic discipline. The Prophet stated, whoever believes in Allah and the last day should say good or remain silent.
On the surface, say good or remain silent sounds like, I don't know, a simplistic proverb you might find on a kindergarten classroom poster.
Right, like if you don't have anything nice to say.
Exactly. But the psychological restraint required to actually implement it is staggering. We have an incredibly strong neurological impulse to voice every complaint, every criticism, every unsolicited opinion that crosses our minds.
Oh, constantly.
If society universally applied this one filter, entire industries built on outrage and gossip would collapse overnight.
Twitter would cease to exist. It acts as an absolute filter against societal harm. Now, the second maxim moves from linguistic restraint to establishing firm interpersonal boundaries. The tradition states, From the perfection of a person's Islam is that he leaves that which does not concern him.
Wow. That feels like a direct intervention for our modern era of unwarranted curiosity.
Oh, completely.
Leaving what doesn't concern you is the ultimate antidote to doom scrolling, obsessing over celebrity drama, or prying into the private struggles of a neighbor.
It establishes an internal locus of control. It forces you to focus entirely on your own spiritual and practical responsibilities rather than consuming the lives of others.
That's powerful. Okay, so what's the third one?
The third maxim forms the core of emotional regulation. A man repeatedly asked the prophet for advice, and the prophet provided the same two-word answer each time. Do not become angry.
Just do not become angry.
Yeah. This maxim is entirely focused on preventing the escalation of interpersonal conflict by controlling the internal spark before it becomes ablaze.
And if I had to guess the fourth, based on the trajectory of these rules, we've moved from speech to privacy to emotional control. The final one must be about proactive benevolence toward others.
Your intuition is spot on. The fourth maxim defines active empathy. The prophet stated, "None of you truly believe until he loves for his brother what he loves for himself."
That is a total eradication of jealousy.
Yeah, it really is.
You physically cannot harbor malice or envy towards someone if your internal framework demands that you genuinely desire the exact same success, health, and happiness for them that you desperately want for yourself.
These four maxims, linguistic restraint, respecting privacy, emotional regulation, and active empathy, are not just standalone rules. They're the lenses through which we must read the rest of the Quranic manual.
Okay, so with that theoretical definition established, we have to look at the fuel source. What psychological anchor gives a person the stamina to constantly police their speech, maintain boundaries, suppress anger, and force empathy when their ego is just screaming at them to do the opposite?
It's a lot of pressure. But the sources guide us straight to the very opening of the Quran, Surah Al-Fatihah.
The opening of the text is incredibly revealing, isn't it? Because the Quran doesn't initiate its manual on human character with a rigid, legalistic list of prohibitions.
Right, it doesn't start with, do not steal, do not lie, do not cheat. Instead, it begins by establishing the emotional, psychological, and theological posture of the believer toward the Creator. Surah Al-Fatihah, which is recited in every single unit of daily prayer, frames the universe through dual lenses.
Those lenses being boundless divine mercy juxtaposed with ultimate accountability.
Exactly. Classical exegetes dedicate extensive multi-volume commentaries just to these opening verses, specifically analyzing the divine attributes Ar-Rahman, the most gracious, and Ar-Rahim, the most merciful.
Now, in English translations, this often gets flattened into two slightly different shades of the word mercy. But Ibn Kathir and Al-Tabari provide a much deeper morphological breakdown of the Arabic roots, don't they?
They do. Both names derive from the root word Rama, meaning mercy, or interestingly, a mother's womb.
A mother's womb? That implies profound care and nourishment.
Right. However, Ar-Rahman encompasses a broader, universal scope. It is an existential mercy that envelops all of creation unconditionally. Every human being, every animal, the oxygen we breathe, the sun that warms the earth, this mercy sustains everyone regardless of their belief, actions, or gratitude.
So Ar-Rahman is the mercy of existence itself. You exist, therefore you are currently experiencing Ar-Rahman and Ar-Rahim.
Ar-Rahim denotes a specific, continuous, tailored mercy that is reserved for the believers, particularly concerning their spiritual salvation and their state in the hereafter. It's a protective, intimate mercy. Al-Qurtubi reinforces this by pointing out that grounding the human psyche in this overwhelming, dual-layered divine mercy fundamentally shapes how a believer is required to interact with society.
The logic there is inescapable. If the entity that engineered your existence introduces himself primarily through absolute grace and benevolence, your character has to mirror that benevolence.
You can't authentically claim to worship the most merciful while being ruthlessly unmerciful to your employees.
Exactly, or holding vicious grudges against your family. Your behavior has to be an extension of the attributes you claim to revere.
While that is the ideal, it raises a very natural psychological tension that the scholars address.
I can see the tension clearly. If the entire foundation of your worldview is built on boundless, absolute mercy, human nature will inevitably look for a loophole.
It breeds complacency.
Right. A person could easily rationalize, well, ultimate mercy exists, so I can act however I want. I can cut corners in my business, treat people poorly, and just rely on that infinite grace at the end to wipe the slate clean.
But the Quran anticipates that exact psychological vulnerability. It immediately balances the scale in verse 4 of the same chapter. Master of the Day of Judgment, or Maliki Yawm al-Din. The classical scholar Fakhr al-Din al-Razi observes that this specific juxtaposition, moving immediately from infinite mercy to absolute judgment, prevents that exact complacency.
So it strips away any performative aspect of good behavior.
It creates a state of vigilant equilibrium. The awareness of an ultimate reckoning ensures that your good character is maintained consistently, not conditionally.
So you aren't just polite when it's socially advantageous or when you're trying to secure a promotion.
Right, or when you just want someone to like you. You maintain noble character even in total isolation. Or when dealing with someone who has zero social capital, out of a sense of absolute divine accountability.
Hope in mercy prevents you from falling into despair when you make a mistake, and the fear of accountability prevents you from becoming arrogant or cruel. It's a perfect balance. The sources also highlight a fascinating structural transition in Al-Fatihah regarding how character is actually acquired.
Yeah.
It moves from praising God to a direct, desperate plea for help.
Yes, verse 6, guide us to the straight path. Scholars like Ibn Taymiyyah and Ibn al-Qayyim point out that this repeated plea for guidance reveals a vital psychological reality about akhlaq. Good character is not merely a product of human rationality.
It's not something you achieve just by having strong stoic willpower or reading enough self-improvement literature.
No, it requires an acknowledgement of our own limitations. We cannot bootstrap our way to perfect character. It is a divine concession. It requires constant spiritual dependency.
Dependency.
The Prophet explained in an authentic tradition that Allah divides this chapter into two halves between himself and his servant. When the servant reaches that specific plea for guidance, Allah responds, "This is for my servant, and my servant shall acquire what he has asked for."
So the pursuit of noble character is a collaborative spiritual endeavor. It demands sincere, grueling effort from the individual, perfectly matched by the enabling grace of the Creator.
It fundamentally alters how we approach self-improvement. You must do the work, but you rely entirely on the divine to make that work fruitful.
And once that internal spiritual compass is properly calibrated, the Quran immediately begins to dismantle superficial societal definitions of what it means to be a good person. We see this profound deconstruction in Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 177, which defines the concept of al-bir.
Al-bir meaning holistic righteousness or piety.
The historical context the sources provide for this verse is incredibly relevant to modern performative religiosity. They mention that the earliest Muslim community in Medina had become heavily fixated on the physical direction of prayer, the Qibla.
Right. This happened when the divine command shifted it from Jerusalem to Mecca. Hafiz ibn Kathir notes that this verse was revealed specifically to reorient their psychological focus. The community was getting caught up in the mechanical details. They were debating which way exactly do we face? Are our physical movements perfectly aligned?
That is the exact equivalent of the modern checklist mentality in the wellness and self-improvement space. People obsess over the biohacking mechanics. Drinking precisely 64 ounces of water, waking up at exactly 5:00 a.m., doing a 10-minute cold plunge.
Right, but they completely ignore whether those habits are translating into becoming a kinder, more patient, more empathetic human being. They master the outward form while the internal character remains completely stagnant.
Verse 177 acts as a massive intervention against that mindset.
Yeah.
It explicitly tells them, righteousness is not merely turning your face to the east or the west. That physical direction, while required, is not the core metric of success.
Instead, the verse introduces a massive, multi-tiered framework of character that synthesizes internal faith with proactive, gritty social justice.
The breakdown of al-Bir in the sources reveals 4 distinct dimensions of character. Let's explore the psychology behind each. The first dimension is theological and epistemological.
This encompasses belief in Allah, the last day, the angels, the books, and the prophets. This is the internal intellectual anchor. Ibn Kathir and Al-Tabari explain that without this theological foundation, any outward moral action is completely subjective and unmoored.
Because if your morality is just a social construct, it's going to change with the wind of cultural trends.
Exactly. The belief in the unseen and ultimate accountability is the engine that drives the consistency of your ethics.
It provides an objective standard. But the verse doesn't let you linger in abstract thought. It immediately forces that belief into the physical world through the second dimension, financial and social philanthropy. It states that true righteousness is giving wealth, despite your love for it, to relatives, orphans, the needy, travelers, and freeing slaves.
The phrasing, despite love for it, is the psychological crux here. True character requires genuine economic sacrifice.
It's not just tossing spare change.
No, generosity is not defined by tossing your spare change at a problem when it doesn't affect your bottom line. It's a primary manifestation of detachment from the material world. You prove the sincerity of your internal faith by physically parting with the wealth you worked hard to accumulate and giving it to the most vulnerable socioeconomic demographics.
It proves that internal belief is completely sterile if it doesn't seamlessly translate into proactive social welfare.
Then the third dimension reinforces this balance through devotional consistency, establishing prayer, and giving zakah, the obligatory charity.
Which is about maintaining the rhythm of a disciplined life. It ensures the vertical spiritual connection with the divine through prayer and fortifies the horizontal institutional welfare of society through zakah.
Which leads to the fourth dimension, which the scholars describe as the ultimate litmus test of character: ethical and emotional resilience. The verse highlights those who fulfill their contracts and who are patient in poverty, disease, and times of severe duress.
Al-Razi and Al-Qurtubi highlight this extensively because it exposes our true nature, right?
Oh, completely. It is relatively easy to be generous when your bank account is full, or to pray when you are perfectly healthy and comfortable. But maintaining your integrity, honoring your verbal and written promises, and remaining emotionally stable under extreme psychological, financial, and physical duress, that is the absolute proof of true birr.
This comprehensive approach ensures you cannot hide behind one good trait. You need the intellectual anchor of belief, the detachment required for radical generosity, the discipline of daily devotion, and the unbreakable resilience to withstand suffering without compromising your ethics.
If you are missing one, your character is structurally unsound.
And this comprehensive societal approach is reinforced earlier in the same chapter in verse 83. This verse outlines a solemn covenant taken for the children of Israel, which scholars universally agree establishes an enduring foundational moral precedent for Muslims as well.
This verse contains the ultimate mandate for gentle speech. The translation reads, "And recall when we took the covenant from the children of Israel. Do not worship except Allah, and speak to people good words."
The Arabic phrase used is وَقْوَلُوا لِلنَّاسِ حُسْنًا. Fakhr al-Din al-Razi and al-Qurtubi extract profound sociological implications from this specific phrasing, don't they?
They do. They emphasize that the command to speak good words to people is absolute. It is entirely unqualified by the text.
Meaning, there are no footnotes attached to the command.
None.
There are no conditional clauses saying, speak nicely to people unless they're really annoying, or unless they hold opposing political views, or unless they were rude to you first.
It is a blanket mandate. It does not matter what the recipient's faith is, what their socioeconomic status is, or even what the reciprocal attitude toward you happens to be. Kindness in speech is framed as an unconditional, inalienable right of all humanity. The specific word used is al-Naas, mankind, not just fellow believers within the community.
Sayyid Abul al-Maududi makes a fascinating point about this in his exegesis. He asserts that verses like this serve as the ultimate divine guarantee for the protection, dignity, and religious tolerance of non-Muslims within an Islamic societal framework.
Because the mandate for everyday etiquette, the simple act of speaking kindly, is included in the exact same divine covenant as strict monotheism. The verse pairs worshiping God alone directly with speaking kindly to mankind.
It elevates basic human decency from a mere social pleasantry to a rigid theological obligation. You cannot claim to fulfill your covenant with the Creator if your tongue is abusive toward His creation.
But applying that covenant introduces a massive real-world challenge.
Because it's relatively easy to have good character in a vacuum. It is easy to speak kindly when everyone in the room agrees with you and praises you.
The true test of this Quranic manual, the real psychological crucible, occurs when the believer's inner compass collides with the hostility and provocation of others.
And that collision brings us to the architecture of emotional regulation, specifically regarding forgiveness and anger management, outlined in Surah Al-Imran, verse 134. This verse provides one of the most exhaustive and psychologically profound profiles of the righteous mind.
The verse describes those who spend during ease and hardship, who restrain anger, and who pardon the people. The sources are very clear that the linguistic progression here is not random. It is a highly sophisticated, sequential, three-step methodology for emotional intelligence.
Let's unpack the triad of emotional mastery, starting with step 1. Kazimeen al-Ghayz, usually translated as restraining anger.
The translation restraining anger is actually a bit too mild to capture the psychology here. The Arabic term ghayz is critical. It does not just mean a mild annoyance or general irritation, which would be ghadab. Ghayz refers specifically to an intense boiling rage.
Wow, boiling rage.
Yes, it is a visceral physiological reaction to severe provocation or injustice.
It's that feeling when your heart rate spikes, your vision narrows, and your body is flooded with adrenaline screaming at you to retaliate.
Exactly. Ibn Kathir and Al-Jalain explain that the righteous person doesn't just avoid acting on this rage, they actively swallow it. That is what the word kazm literally means, to swallow or repress a choking substance so that it doesn't leak out through your speech or manifest as a physical reaction to inflict harm.
That's a powerful image. Swallowing a choking substance.
Ibn Rajab al-Hanbali cited early scholars who literally defined the entirety of good character as simply leaving aside anger and patiently enduring what comes from people.
Because if you cannot control that initial wave of boiling rage, you will burn down your relationships, your reputation, and your own peace of mind. But the Quranic manual recognizes that suppression is not a long-term solution. Step 2 transitions from swallowing anger to Afeena al-Naas, pardoning the people. If I swallow my anger, why isn't that enough to fulfill the requirement of good character?
Because the Quran demonstrates a profound understanding of human psychology. If you swallow intense rage and simply leave it unaddressed internally, it mutates.
It ferments.
Yes, unresolved anger ferments in the subconscious. It turns into deeply rooted malice, resentment, and a toxic desire for vengeance, what the Arabic tradition calls heat. It essentially rots your psyche from the inside out.
Suppressed anger becomes a poison that you are drinking, hoping the other person dies.
Precisely. Therefore, the immediate mandatory next step is a map of erasing the grievance entirely from your heart. It means consciously relinquishing your right to retaliation or compensation. You actively let go of the grudge so that the poison of resentment doesn't kill your own spiritual heart.
And then, incredibly, there is a third step. Step 3, Muzneen. The verse concludes, and Allah loves the doers of good. The scholars argue this implies moving beyond neutral forgiveness into active benevolence toward the transgressor.
It is the absolute pinnacle of human character. You don't just swallow the physiological rage, you don't just erase the psychological grudge, you actually attempt to turn the adversary into an ally by responding to their harm with proactive kindness. You do good to the very person who wronged you.
The psychological strength required to achieve that feels almost superhuman. But the sources don't just leave it as theory. They bring up the historical example of the intellectual titan, Ibn Taymiyyah, to prove it is possible.
His life was incredibly tumultuous. He faced intense political persecution, multiple imprisonments, and vicious smear campaigns from intellectual adversaries.
Yet historical accounts note that he would persistently and sincerely seek forgiveness for his oppressors.
He viewed the suppression of personal vengeance not as a sign of weakness, but as a strict prerequisite for divine justice and his own spiritual purity. He refused to let the darkness of his oppressors dictate his internal state or pollute his own heart.
Ibn al-Qayyim analyzed this exact process of emotional regulation in a way that aligns perfectly with modern therapeutic concepts. He issued a stark warning against what modern psychology calls spiritual bypassing.
Right. Spiritual bypassing is the tendency to use spiritual ideas or religious platitudes to sidestep, ignore, or repress unresolved emotional issues or psychological wounds. Ibn al-Qayyim argued that to truly overcome the dark side of the human psyche, you must first acknowledge the painful reality of your emotions.
You cannot just pretend you aren't angry and slap a pious label on your trauma.
Exactly. You have to actually feel the boiling rage, validate the fact that you were genuinely wronged, and then consciously, painfully surrender the desire for retaliation. It is an active, grueling process, not a passive wave of a magic wand.
It is only through that conscious, deliberate surrender of the ego that a believer transcends mechanical, ritualistic worship and achieves ihsan, which is a state of spiritual excellence.
And that proactive stance against provocation is further reinforced in Surah Al-Araf, verse 199. It issues a three-part command. Take to forgiveness, enjoin what is good, and turn away from the ignorant.
The historical context of this revelation is fascinating. Imam al-Tabari and al-Qurtubi document that when this specific verse came down, the Prophet Muhammad actually asked the Archangel Jibril for clarification on how to apply such a broad command practically.
And Jibril's response sets an unbelievably high, almost paradoxical standard of grace. Jibril clarified that it meant to pardon the one who does you wrong, be generous to the one who gives you nothing, and continue your relation with the one who cuts you off.
That perfectly encapsulates the non-reactionary nature of Quranic character. A believer's conduct is never dictated by the provocations, insults, or stinginess of others. You do not allow the ignorant to drag you down to their baseline of behavior.
You operate entirely on an internal, unwavering moral compass. By commanding believers to turn away, the Quran advocates for strict emotional and social boundaries. It preserves your psychological peace by giving you divine permission to walk away from fruitless, toxic disputes.
Now, I am looking at this absolute mandate to turn away from the ignorant and forgive. But historically, I know there are verses dealing with warfare and strict combat. How do classical scholars square those two realities?
That's the million-dollar question.
Right. Didn't some later factions claim that these peaceful verses were just canceled out or abrogated by later verses regarding armed conflict when the Muslims gained political power?
You're touching on the highly complex jurisprudential debate regarding nask, or abrogation. Specifically, this centers around Surah at-Tawbah, verse 5, often referred to historically as the verse of the sword.
And that dealt with severe armed conflict against hostile polytheists who had repeatedly broken peace treaties and committed treason.
Correct. Historically, some groups did argue that this verse abrogated or nullified all the previous injunctions for peaceful discourse and turning away from the ignorant.
But if that theory of abrogation were accepted, it would completely undermine everything we've discussed. It would imply the Quranic mandate for good character was just a temporary, pragmatic phase when the Muslims were weak and was canceled the moment they gained leverage.
Exactly. But a critical analysis of the scholarly data reveals that the mainstream classical heavyweights, led by towering figures like Ibn Kathir, alongside a very strong modern academic consensus, vehemently reject this sweeping application of abrogation.
So how do they resolve the apparent contradiction between a verse commanding you to turn away and a verse commanding you to fight?
They explain that later generations fundamentally misunderstood the terminology used by the early scholars. The early predecessors, known as the Mutaqaddimun, used the word abrogation in a much broader, more nuanced sense. They used it to mean the specification of a general rule, or contextualizing a command to a specific scenario, not necessarily deleting it from the legal code.
The consensus resolves this by asserting contextual specificity. So it's about applying the right rule to the right reality.
Exactly. The verses commanding sternness and combat apply strictly and exclusively in the context of active, legitimate warfare, broken treaties, and threats to state security. You cannot logically apply the turn away and forgive verse when an invading army is actively attacking your city.
Right, that would just be suicidal.
But conversely, Surah 7.199, the command to forgive, be generous, and ignore the ignorant, remains the perpetual, unabrogated moral baseline for daily interpersonal relations, societal ethics, and times of peace. The command for noble character was never canceled. It simply governs the civilian sphere, separate from the rules of military engagement.
The rules of the battlefield do not apply to the marketplace. That makes total sense. But, that rule of turning away from the ignorant isn't just for public spaces. The real tragedy is that the most insidious erosion of character actually happens behind closed doors, with the people we are most comfortable with.
Yes, the domestic sphere.
Exactly. Which brings us to what we could call the ego's graveyard. The Quran addresses this domestic reality directly, focusing heavily on filial piety, the treatment of parents. In Surah Al-Isra, verses 23 and 24, the command is explicit, profound, and deeply challenging.
Your Lord has decreed that you worship none but him, and that you be kind to parents. Whether one or both of them reach old age while with you, say not to them so much as "uff," and do not repel them, but speak to them a noble word.
Al-Qurtubi does a deep linguistic analysis on the word qada here, translated as decreed. He notes this as an absolute, unalterable divine injunction. It is not a suggestion for a harmonious household. It is juxtaposed directly next to the uncompromising worship of God himself.
It elevates the ethical, patient treatment of parents to the highest echelon of religious duty, and the behavioral metrics provided in this verse are astonishingly precise. It proves that true character is measured most accurately in the private domestic sphere.
Because that's where our patience is tested the most severely and where our guard is completely down.
Right. It is incredibly easy to be polite and charming to a stranger or a coworker you interact with for 5 minutes. It is agonizingly difficult to maintain perfect patience with an aging parent whose care requires massive personal, financial, and emotional sacrifice.
The text specifically zeroes in on the word uff. It strictly prohibits saying it, and uff isn't even a curse word. It's essentially just the sound of exasperation. It is a heavy sigh. So why is a sigh elevated to the level of a profound divine prohibition?
Because the sigh reveals the internal state of the heart. It indicates that physical service to your parents is rendered invalid if it is accompanied by emotional reluctance, subtle rudeness, or making them feel like a burden.
Wow.
You cannot perform the physical action of caring for them while simultaneously using your breath to signal your annoyance. The esteemed scholar Al-Dahabi, in his famous book Al-Kabir, which catalogs the major sins in Islam, classifies any form of disrespect, neglect, or emotional abuse toward parents as one of the most destructive sins a human can commit.
A sin that directly severs one's spiritual relationship with Allah. The classical scholars even cite a prophetic hadith calling cursing one's parents the greatest of great sins.
Fakhr al-Din al-Razi points out the brilliant psychological mechanism behind the specific prayer mandated in the very next verse. My Lord, have mercy upon them as they brought me up when I was small. He asserts that forcing the tongue to utter this prayer forces the believer to actively suppress their own massive ego.
Wait, how does that suppress the ego?
Because it forces you to mentally transport yourself back to a time of complete, humiliating, infantile vulnerability. It demands that you remember when you could not feed yourself, clean yourself, or protect yourself, and forces you to recall the sleepless nights and sacrifices made by your guardians.
It shatters the arrogance of the capable adult by reminding them of their absolute dependency as an infant.
Precisely. And arrogance is exactly what the Quran targets next, not just in how we speak to our parents, but in how our ego physically leaks out of us in our daily movement.
Surah Luqman, verses 18 and 19, details a father's advice to his son regarding the physical manifestations of humility. The verse warns, "And do not turn your cheek toward people in contempt, nor walk through the earth exultantly. Indeed, Allah does not like everyone self-deluded and boastful."
When you read this, you immediately think of modern nonverbal communication. So much of how we assert dominance or establish hierarchy today is not through screaming, but through physical microaggressions of superiority.
Oh, definitely. Ibn Kathir interprets the phrase turning the cheek, which is musa'ir in Arabic, exactly along those lines. It's the physical act of looking away, rolling the eyes, turning your shoulder, or displaying glazed-over disinterest when someone else is speaking to you.
It's utilizing your body language to subtly signal contempt, or to assert that your time is vastly more valuable than theirs. True Quranic character demands full physical attention, active listening, and a cheerful, engaged countenance when interacting with others, regardless of their status.
Then the verse dissects the arrogant boaster. Sayyid Abul Ala-Madudi breaks down the specific Arabic terms used here, muqtal and fakur.
The psychological precision of those two words is brilliant. Muqal refers to the internal psychological disease. It describes a person who holds an inflated, delusional opinion of their own self-worth, intellect, or importance.
The mashahur.
Fakhr is the external symptom of that internal disease. It is the person who verbalizes this superiority, the one who actively boasts, name drops, and constantly lists their achievements to ensure everyone in the room recognizes their elevated status.
But the symptom isn't just verbal. It affects how they physically move through space. The verse explicitly prohibits walking exultantly or aggressively. The scholars connect this to a passage in Surah Al-Isra that basically mocks human arrogance by reminding us of our physical insignificance.
Yes, it says, "Verily, you can neither rend nor penetrate the earth, nor can you attain a stature like the mountains in height."
It acts as a humbling reality check on gravity and biology. You are a small, fragile, mortal creature, so why are you stomping around as if you own the planet?
The subsequent verse in Luqman commands moderation in your pace and lowering your voice. It indicates that excessive volume, shouting, and erratic, aggressive movements are essentially egoistic attempts to dominate physical and auditory space.
So the ideal Quranic character is physically grounded. It is quiet, deliberate, and deeply respectful of the presence of others in a shared space.
Now, when this physical humility breaks down and emotional boundaries are violated on a larger communal scale, society begins to rot from the inside out. That leads us to Surah Al-Hujurat, which operates as the definitive constitutional text for preserving the social fabric of a Muslim community.
This is such a critical segment of the synthesis. Surah Al-Hujurat systematically dismantles those specific linguistic, psychological, and behavioral vices that breed enmity and destroy communities. It addresses the pipeline of social decay. Let's start with verse 11, which targets mockery, defamation, and nicknames.
The verse strictly prohibits men and women from mocking each other, warning that the person being mocked might actually be vastly superior to the mocker in the sight of God. Contemporary scholar Numan Ali Khan provides a fantastic linguistic analysis of the specific Arabic terms used here, starting with the word lambs.
Lambs is often translated as defamation, But it is a very specific, insidious kind of defamation, isn't it?
It is. Lambs refers to pointing out the flaws of others in a subtle, underhanded way. It is not necessarily screaming a direct insult across a room. It is the sarcastic remark, the backhanded compliment, the subtle shift in body language meant to demean someone socially while maintaining plausible deniability.
So it's designed to inflict social damage without leaving fingerprints.
Exactly. And then the verse addresses Tanabazu.
Kanabazu is the mutual calling of offensive nicknames. The morphology of the Arabic word implies a reciprocal, escalating nature. It is a mutually destructive exchange of verbal abuse. You label me with something offensive, I retaliate with a worse label, and the dignity of both individuals is destroyed in the process.
Maududi makes a very profound philosophical point about this practice. He notes that substituting a person's noble identity with a derogatory label is equivalent to replacing their title of faith with a title of wickedness, or fusik. It is a grave spiritual offense to strip someone of their complex, dignified human identity and reduce them to a caricature, a physical flaw, or a past mistake.
That verbal abuse and mockery is usually the final outward stage of an internal psychological rot, which the Quran details in the very next verse, 49.2. This verse identifies the precise progression of interpersonal sin. Scholars like Sayyid Qutb note that this verse builds an absolute fortress around the privacy, dignity, and civil liberties of the individual.
I look at the progression in this verse like a deeply flawed judicial process happening entirely inside someone's head. You end up playing the judge, the jury, and the executioner, and the victim doesn't even know they are on trial.
The Tunisian scholar Ibn Ashur outlines this destructive pipeline beautifully. It starts with the first internal misstep, dawn or suspicion.
The verse commands believers to avoid much suspicion, for indeed some suspicion is a sin. Ibn Ashur explains the psychology here perfectly. A person harbors a negative thought or assumption about someone's motives. Instead of resisting it, they entertain it, feed it, and dwell on it until it solidifies into a false sense of absolute certainty.
Once that bias is established, the individual starts psychologically misinterpreting every subsequent observation as validation.
It is confirmation bias on steroids. If I internally decide that you are a greedy person, every time you reach for your wallet a little slowly or ask a question about a bill, I log it as irrefutable evidence. Once that suspicion is locked in, it naturally progresses to step 2 of the pipeline, tajassus, or spying.
Because once you internally validate your evil suspicion, you feel a justified, almost righteous compulsion to investigate and prove you were right.
The Quran explicitly commands, do not spy. This unconditionally outlaws intrusive investigation, eavesdropping, reading people's private messages, digging into their past, or violating their physical or digital privacy. It destroys the foundational trust required for any functioning society.
And that leads to the final execution phase, ghibah, or backbiting, speaking ill of a person in their absence. And it is crucial to note here, backbiting applies even if the information you found while spying is 100% factually accurate.
Yes, exposing it publicly to degrade the person is still a major sin. If it is false, it becomes slander, which is an even worse crime. Sayyid Qutb and Maududi both emphasize the uniquely repulsive metaphor the Quran uses to illustrate the gravity of backbiting. The verse asks a horrifying rhetorical question. Would any of you like to eat the flesh of his dead brother? You would despise that.
It literally equates character assassination with cannibalism. That is a jarring image to conceptualize. Why use such extreme imagery for something as commonplace as gossip?
The logic behind the metaphor is brilliant and devastating. Just as a dead, inanimate corpse cannot defend itself against physical mutilation, an absent person cannot defend their honor against slander, gossip, and rumor. It highlights the ultimate cowardice of the act. You are striking someone who cannot strike back.
The visceral, natural human disgust we feel at the thought of consuming a corpse must be applied to the act of consuming someone's reputation for entertainment.
It's a terrifying image, and it works to short-circuit the evolutionary habit of gossiping for social bonding. But we need to clarify a scholarly nuance here regarding that first step. Suspicion, or done. The verse says, avoid much suspicion because some suspicion is a sin. That phrasing implies there are times when suspicion is not a sin. When is it permissible?
It is an excellent distinction. Scholarly exegesis categorizes dawn into varying legal and moral statuses. First, there is encouraged suspicion, known as Husan al-Dawn. This is the requirement to actively harbor good assumptions about Allah and about your fellow human beings.
The Caliph Umar ibn al-Khattab famously advised that you should never assume evil of a brother's word. If a positive interpretation is even remotely possible, you default heavily to grace.
If someone ignores you in the hallway, Husn al-Dan demands you assume they were distracted or didn't hear you, rather than assuming they are arrogant and hate you. Then there is involuntary suspicion.
Right. Fleeting, intrusive negative thoughts naturally cross the human mind. Those are beyond conscious control. The strict prohibition does not apply to a passing thought. The sin only occurs when you willfully accept it, harbor it, and act upon it without trying to fight it off.
And finally, permissible or necessary suspicion. Al-Tabari and Al-Qurtubi highlight exceptions where skepticism is logically and legally required. We are not commanded to be naive or allow ourselves to be victimized.
In matters of state security, warfare, vetting testimonies in a judicial court, or protecting a community from known criminals or predators, maintaining a high level of guarded suspicion is a pragmatic necessity. You do not apply Husn al-Dan to a known embezzler applying to be your accountant, or a known predator interacting with children.
Common sense and safety still apply. But outside of those specific security exceptions, the overarching Quranic rule defaults heavily to assuming the absolute innocence, honor, and integrity of a fellow believer. It demands that we aggressively police our own internal biases before they manifest into outward social sins.
This brings us to the culmination of our deep dive. We possess the theoretical framework of Akhlaq, the psychological steps for anger management, and the strict social boundaries protecting privacy. The final question is, how does this all synthesize into a single human life? And what is the ultimate anchor that keeps that life steady when the pressure is unbearable?
The Quran provides the ultimate paradigm, a living case study in Surah Al-Ahzab, verse 21. There has certainly been for you in the Messenger of Allah an excellent pattern for anyone whose hope is in Allah on the last day and who remembers Allah often. Contemporary scholar Omar Suleiman extracts a highly systematic framework from this verse. He talks about building a believer's collision rating.
I find that concept incredibly useful. A collision rating is a measure of psychological and spiritual resilience. It is your capacity to withstand severe trials, betrayals, financial ruin, and emotional hardships without breaking character or compromising your ethics. Suleiman identifies 3 strict prerequisites outlined in this exact verse to build that indestructible resilience.
If I'm looking at the verse, the first ingredient seems to be tied to prioritizing the creator over creation. Because if you care too much about social favor, your character will compromise immediately under pressure.
You hit the nail on the head. Ingredient number 1 is desiring Allah. This means prioritizing the creator's pleasure over the creation's approval. This paradigm shift eradicates the root cause of so many character flaws. If you do not desperately seek social favor, you won't lie, cheat, or compromise your ethics to fit in. It protects the heart from associating partners with Allah and ensures your actions are entirely sincere.
And ingredient number 2 naturally follows, seeking the last day.
This requires maintaining a long-term eschatological perspective. If you only practice good character for worldly benefits, like building a good corporate reputation or expecting immediate reciprocity and gratitude from people, your character will inevitably collapse the moment you are placed under severe pressure or the moment the other person is ungrateful.
Because if you sacrifice your time to do a massive favor for someone, and they spit in your face, and your only goal was their gratitude, you will become incredibly bitter and regret doing good. But if your goal was a reward in the hereafter, their ingratitude does not derail your emotional state. Viewing character as an investment for the hereafter prevents hypocrisy and fuels enduring patience.
Ingredient number 3 is frequent remembrance of Allah, or dhikr. Keeping your tongue and your heart constantly engaged with the divine protects your ego from riya, which is showing off. A heart preoccupied with remembering the Creator does not desperately seek the praise, validation, or remembrance of the masses. It keeps you deeply, authentically humble.
We see the practical application of this prophetic resilience most clearly in the domestic sphere, where the ego is hardest to control. Surah At-Tarin gives us a brilliant example of marital discretion. The Quran recounts a situation where the prophet confided a secret to one of his wives, who then breached his trust and disclosed it to another.
Verse 66.3 notes a profound detail about how he handled the subsequent confrontation. It says, he made known a part of it and avoided or overlooked a part. The Arabic phrasing is, arafa barahu warada ambat.
Classical commentators like Al-Qurtubi and Al-Jalain emphasize that the prophet had the full, justified right to expose the entire breach of trust. He could have thoroughly reprimanded her, laid out every single detail of how she was wrong, and demanded total submission to his grievance.
But he actively chose not to. Out of extreme gentleness, emotional intelligence, and a desire to spare his spouse intense psychological humiliation, he only mentioned a fraction of the issue, just enough to let her know he was aware of the breach, and he purposefully overlooked the rest. Contemporary exegesis views this as a vital pedagogical tool for modern relationships. True character involves overlooking the faults of others, particularly your spouse, and refraining from total emotional annihilation during an argument. You do not need to win every point or crush your opponent with evidence.
That restraint, that absolute mastery over the ego, is exactly why the zenith of Quranic praise is found in Surah Al-Qalam, verse 4, where Allah addresses the Prophet directly. And indeed, you are of a great moral character. Kulakatim. When the Prophet's wife Aisha was asked to describe his manners, she summarized it perfectly. His character was the Quran. He was the walking embodiment of everything we've discussed today.
Ibn Kathir cites a story from the Musnad of Imam Ahmad that brilliantly illustrates this, taking all these abstract concepts and placing them in a highly volatile domestic scenario. Aisha had prepared a dish of food for the Prophet and his guests. However, another wife, Hafsa, also sent a dish of food via her maidservant to the exact same gathering.
Driven by a moment of very human jealousy regarding who was providing for the Prophet, Aisha instructed her own maidservant to intercept Hafsa's servant and throw the dish away. The bowl falls to the ground and completely shatters, spilling the food everywhere in front of the Prophet and his guests. The tension in that room must have been suffocating.
Consider the cultural and patriarchal expectations of that era. Most men, especially a leader of a state and a prophet, would react with intense anger. The expected response would be shouting, enforcing harsh discipline for the destruction of property, and demanding an apology for the public disrespect in front of guests. The ego demands vindication in that moment.
But his reaction defies every egoistic impulse. He calmly kneels down on the ground. He gathers the broken pieces of pottery with his own hands and scoops up the spilled food himself. He gently diffuses the tension by looking at his guests and saying, "Your mother became jealous." And then he ensures justice simply by providing a replacement dish from Aisha's house to send back to Hafsa.
It is the absolute perfect embodiment of everything we analyze in Surah Al-Imran. The suppression of intense, boiling anger, the implementation of immediate pardon without demanding an apology, and responding with proactive good by replacing the dish. He prioritized the dignity of his household over his own ego.
It is breathtaking emotional control. And this entire system, this magnificent, intricate structure of human behavior, requires a foundational bedrock to survive the storms of life. Which brings us to our final point, the existential necessity of faith. Surah Al-Ahzab declares that all of mankind is in a state of profound loss, except those who possess faith, perform righteous deeds, and advise one another to truth and patience.
Syed Abu al-Maududi and Imam al-Tabari extrapolate a profound philosophical conclusion from this very short chapter. They explain that faith, or Iman, provides the only firm, objective basis for morality. Without the anchor of faith and the expectation of ultimate divine accountability, the life of a human being, no matter how outwardly pleasant, philanthropic, or refined their manners may appear to be, is ultimately aimless and subjective.
Maududi's metaphor here is so clarifying. He likens morality without faith to a ship without an anchor, which is entirely at the mercy of the waves, wherever they may take it. One day, society decides a certain behavior is highly moral. The next decade, cultural trends shift, and that exact same behavior is deemed immoral. The ship just drifts with the currents of public opinion.
Therefore, the performance of righteous deeds, which encompasses all kinds of virtuous conduct, empathy, and good character, is entirely and inescapably dependent upon that theological anchor of belief in the Creator. You are good because God is good, and you will return to Him. That never changes.
We have covered an immense amount of ground today. We've seen that the Quranic manual proves that character, or Akhlaq, is not just a secular social agreement designed to make society run a little smoother. It is the definitive physical manifestation of faith itself. It ranges from the higher theological concepts, how we perceive absolute divine mercy and balance it with the terror of ultimate accountability, down to the gritty, unglamorous details of daily life.
It dictates how we swallow our boiling anger when we are wronged, how we physically walk upon the earth without an ounce of arrogance, and how we protect the hidden honor of our neighbors by refusing to spy or consume gossip.
It is an active, deeply collaborative pursuit. It requires immense discipline, constant self-reflection, the suppression of the ego, and ultimate reliance on divine guidance to rewire our spiritual DNA.
And through the living embodiment of the Prophet Muhammad, the text proves that this sublime, elevated character is not a myth. It's entirely attainable for the believer who anchors their heart in the hereafter and refuses to let the ignorance of the world drag them down.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a final provocative thought to mull over. Think about your own internal wiring, your own unique spiritual DNA. What happens if we stop viewing our most frustrating daily encounters? That person who cuts you off in traffic, the coworker who tests your patience with petty remarks, or the family member who seems to know exactly how to push every button you have. What if we stop viewing them as mere nuisances trying to ruin our day? What if we start viewing them as the exact spiritual gym equipment specifically designed and placed in your life by the Creator to build your collision rating? How would that shift in perspective change the way you respond when you wake up tomorrow morning?
That's a profound thought to leave on.
Jazakallah khair. May Allah reward you with goodness for spending your valuable time listening to us.